The day everything changed at Riverside Manor. The crystal chandeliers of Riverside Manor Hotel sparkled like diamonds as Thomas Bennett straightened his burgundy tie for the third time that morning. At 58 years old, he had spent nearly 4 decades climbing the hospitality ladder, and today represented the pinnacle of his career. A wealthy businessman from Beijing, Mr. Chen Wei, was arriving to discuss a multi-million-dollar investment that could transform the historic hotel into an international destination. Thomas stood in the marble lobby, surrounded by his management team. Everything had to be perfect. The flowers were freshly arranged. The floors gleamed. Even the air seemed to hold its breath in anticipation. When the black sedan pulled up to the entrance, Thomas felt his heart quicken. Mr. Chen stepped out, a distinguished man in his early 60s, wearing an impeccably tailored navy suit. Behind him came 4 associates, each carrying leather folders that Thomas knew contained documents worth millions. "Welcome to Riverside Manor, Mr. Chen," Thomas said warmly, extending his hand with his most confident smile. Mr. Chen shook his hand briefly, then immediately turned to his associates and began speaking rapidly in Mandarin. The musical tones filled the lobby as his team responded, their conversation flowing naturally while Thomas stood frozen, his smile becoming increasingly strained. He pulled out his phone, fingers fumbling as he opened a translation app. The words came out choppy and awkward when he tried to respond. Mr. Chen's expression shifted from neutral to concerned. One of the associates, a younger woman, noticed Thomas's distress and spoke in accented English. "Mr. Chen is asking about the conference facilities and whether your staff can accommodate Mandarin-speaking guests." Thomas felt sweat forming on his brow. Of course. We have translation apps available, and our staff is trained to be very accommodating." But as they moved toward the elevators, Mr. Chen continued speaking to his team in Mandarin, his tone growing more skeptical. Thomas didn't need a translator to understand that tone. He had heard it before, in the voices of guests who were beginning to have doubts. In the private conference room upstairs, Thomas launched into his carefully prepared presentation, but every few minutes, Mr. Chen would interrupt with questions in Mandarin. The young associate would translate, but Thomas could see the frustration building in Mr. Chen's eyes. Something was being lost in translation, not just words, but meaning and intention. "Mr. Chen wants to know about local regulations for foreign investors," the associate explained. "Specifically, the new zoning laws and how they compare to similar regulations in Shanghai." Thomas blinked. He had prepared answers about room rates and amenities, not complex legal matters. "I can have our legal team prepare a detailed report," he offered, hearing the uncertainty in his own voice. Mr. Chen spoke again, his tone sharper. The associate hesitated before translating. "He is concerned that a hotel seeking international investment is not prepared for international communication." The words hit Thomas like a cold wave. 38 years of experience, and he was watching his greatest opportunity slip away because of a language barrier he should have anticipated. Down in the corridor, wiping down a brass handrail, was Grace Morrison. At 52, she had worked in housekeeping at Riverside Manor for 6 years. Her gray uniform was crisp, her movements efficient as she went about her tasks. Most guests never really looked at her. Most staff barely noticed her presence. But Grace noticed everything. She had heard the commotion when Mr. Chen arrived. Now, through the partially open conference room door, she could hear the struggling conversation. She understood every word of Mr. Chen's Mandarin, every nuance of his growing frustration. Grace had spent 12 years in China, teaching English at universities in Beijing and Shanghai. She held a master's degree in linguistics and had become fluent in Mandarin, not from textbooks alone, but from living the language, understanding the culture deeply. When she returned to America, she had applied for countless positions in education and international business. But at 46, competing against younger candidates, the rejection letters had piled up. The housekeeping job at Riverside Manor had been meant as temporary. 6 years later, she was still there, her language skills unused, her education a distant memory that seemed to belong to someone else's life. Now, listening to the meeting fall apart, Grace felt something stir inside her. It was partly professional pride, partly frustration at watching an opportunity dissolve due to something she could easily fix, and partly, after 6 years of being invisible, a quiet voice asking, "What if?" She set down her cleaning cloth and removed her work gloves. Her hands trembled slightly as she smoothed her hair. 6 years of staying in her lane, of not making waves. 6 years of being told through silence and indifference that her place was to clean, not to contribute. Grace took a deep breath and walked to the conference room door. Thomas was trying once again to use his translation app when Grace knocked softly. Every head turned toward the doorway. "Excuse me," Grace said quietly. "I apologize for interrupting." Thomas's face flushed with irritation. "Not now, please. We're in an important meeting." But Grace looked directly at Mr. Chen and spoke in clear, elegant Mandarin. "Honored Mr. Chen, I could not help but overhear your concerns. Perhaps I might be of assistance with communication." The room went completely silent. Mr. Chen's eyes widened in genuine surprise. He studied Grace for a long moment, taking in her housekeeping uniform, then responded in rapid Mandarin, testing her. "Your pronunciation is excellent. Where did you learn to speak our language?" "I lived in Beijing and Shanghai for 12 years, Grace replied in Mandarin. "I taught at several universities and studied your language and culture extensively. I understand you have concerns about the zoning regulations and how they might affect your investment." She then turned to Thomas and explained in English what Mr. Chen had been asking. As she spoke, translating not just words but context and cultural nuances, the atmosphere in the room began to shift. Thomas stared at Grace as if seeing her for the first time. "You speak Mandarin?" "How did I not know this?" "It was on my application, sir," Grace said simply, "under qualifications and language skills." Mr. Chen spoke again, this time with interest rather than frustration. Grace translated fluidly, then responded to his questions with detailed knowledge about local business regulations, comparing them naturally to similar systems in major Chinese cities. Thomas pulled out a chair. "Please, sit down. Join us." For the next hour, Grace facilitated a conversation that finally addressed Mr. Chen's actual concerns. She explained complex regulatory matters. She identified cultural differences in business practices that the hotel needed to understand. She even pointed out aspects of the hotel's current services that would need adaptation for Chinese guests. The breakfast service, for example, she explained to Thomas. Chinese business travelers expect hot congee and tea, not just continental breakfast. And the payment system should integrate with WeChat Pay and Alipay Bar. R. Chen nodded enthusiastically. Grace translated, adding his own observations. The conversation became animated, productive. Thomas's prepared presentation remained unused on the screen, replaced by something far more valuable: genuine understanding. When Mr. Chen mentioned challenges his other properties faced, Grace offered thoughtful solutions that impressed even his experienced associates. At one point, Mr. Chen turned to Thomas with new respect. "Mr. Bennett," he said through Grace's translation, "I am impressed by your hotel's potential. But I must ask, what is this woman's position in your organization? Someone with her skills and knowledge should surely hold a senior role." Thomas's face went pale. "Grace works in our housekeeping department." Mr. Chen's expression showed genuine shock. He looked at Grace, then back to Thomas. "This is most unusual. In my companies, we have systems specifically designed to identify and utilize talent like hers. That someone of her caliber maintains rooms rather than contributes to your international strategy, this concerns me greatly." The criticism, though delivered politely, cut deeply. Thomas saw his hotel suddenly through Mr. Chen's eyes, a place that couldn't recognize the resources it already possessed. "There has clearly been an oversight," Thomas said, his voice tight. "Grace, we need to discuss your future with Riverside Manor immediately after this meeting." As the meeting concluded, Mr. Chen stood and approached Grace. He withdrew a distinctive black and gold business card, presenting it with both hands in the traditional manner. "My personal contact information," he said in Mandarin. "Should you wish to explore opportunities with Chen International, I would be honored to consider your application personally." Grace accepted the card with appropriate respect, her heart pounding. "Thank you, Mr. Chen. That is very kind." Thomas watched the exchange, Gee, understanding finally dawning. For 6 years, extraordinary talent had been right under his nose, invisible simply because he had never thought to truly see. 2 months later, Grace stepped out of the elevator onto the executive floor of Riverside Manor. Her housekeeping uniform had been replaced by a professional Navy suit. Her employee badge now read Director of International Guest Services, a position created specifically for her, with a salary that honored her education and experience. Thomas had offered it the day after Mr. Chen's visit, along with a sincere apology. "I failed you," he had said simply. "I failed to see what was right in front of me. If you'll give me a chance to make this right, I promise things will be different." Grace's new office overlooked the city. On her desk sat 2 framed items, her master's degree, finally displayed after years in storage, and a letter from Mr. Chen confirming his investment in Riverside Manor. But perhaps her most important work was just beginning. Grace had proposed an initiative to identify untapped talents among all hotel staff. In her first survey, she discovered a maintenance worker who was a trained electrician, a kitchen assistant who spoke 4 languages, and a night security guard who held a degree in hospitality management. One by one, Grace was making visible those who had been overlooked. On her second week in her new role, Grace was training the front desk staff on cultural sensitivity when she noticed a young woman in a housekeeping uniform outside the conference room. Their eyes met briefly. The young woman smiled shyly, and Grace saw something familiar there: intelligence, capability, and the quiet hope of someone waiting to be seen. After the training session, Grace approached her. "What's your name?" "Maria, ma'am." "Maria, we're doing a survey of all staff members' skills and education. Would you mind filling one out? Sometimes people have talents that aren't obvious in their current roles." Maria's eyes brightened. "I'd like that. I actually have a degree in accounting, but I couldn't find work when I moved here 3 years ago." Grace smiled warmly. "Well then, let's see what we can do about that." As Maria walked away with the survey form, Grace felt something settle in her heart, not just gratitude for her own changed circumstances, but purpose. She had been given a second chance to use her gifts. Now she would make sure others had that same opportunity. The true measure of an organization, she had learned, wasn't in its marble floors or crystal chandeliers. It was in whether it could see the worth of every person who walked its halls, and Grace was determined to make sure that at Riverside Manor, no one would remain invisible ever again. If this story touched your heart, please take a moment to like this video and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to Silent Stories for more inspiring stories about everyday people whose courage changes everything. And in the comments below, tell us, have you ever felt invisible in your workplace? Or have you discovered hidden talents in someone others overlooked? Your story might inspire someone else. Thank you for listening, and remember, everyone you meet has a story worth hearing.